I would be talking on the subject of identity and culture. In 30 minutes, actually, I will share with you three objectives. First, to explain the concept of identity. Second, to elaborate on identity development, how it develops. And third, as my talk was on identity and culture, I will try to establish some linkages between identity and culture. Basically I'm a clinician, I'm a social psychiatrist. So at the end, I'll just try to see what happens to the identity in illness when you become chronically sick, or like in schizophrenia or Alzheimer's disease. This would be one very last. Now, first let me begin that identity is an umbrella term used throughout the social sciences to describe the person's conception of expression and, these two keywords, conception and expression of the individuality. I think this is a very key thing which will be coming in again and again. In philosophy, identity, from Latin identitas, that means the sameness, and the concept of sameness has given rise to the general concept of identity, as in personal identity or social identity. Now, the other thing which is very important, identity is people's source of meaning and experience. I say conception and expression. Now, other thing which you are using is the meaning and experience. Now, these are the two keywords, what it means. The meaning differs. So the identity is the entire personality of a human being in his or her uniqueness with physical, biological, psychological, societal components, including ethical nature. So actually identity is not just linked with the psychological, but also the physical, biological component and societal aspects. It is a common assumption that identity formation is a universal feature of human experience. A psychological identity, when we talk, it relates to the self-image, a person's mental model of him or herself, which includes self-esteem or individuality. Identity also refers to capacity for self-reflection and awareness of the self. While sociology places some explanatory, we said biological, psychological, and social, weight on the concept of the role behavior. When we talk about the sociological component, the role behavior or interpersonal relationship comes. So the notion of identity negotiation may arise from learning of social roles through personal experiences. Psychologists most commonly use the term identity to describe a personal identity or the idiosyncratic things that make a person unique. It is difficult to find to appropriate place in psychoanalysis. It's very interesting. Sigmund Freud or psychoanalysts till 50s, there is no term identity, the self in whole psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud never used this thing. These terms only came first time in somewhere in 50s. But before that, even interestingly, that even the encyclopedia of psychoanalysis was going, and in the encyclopedia is also missing these terms. So it is equally applicable in social psychology besides the individual psychology. Now, one of the psychoanalysts, besides the Erikson, which I will be talking and which Dr. Paranjape talked quite in detail in the earlier morning session, thought that the term needed cautious scrutiny. I'm using the word that when we talk about the identity, he was a psychoanalyst, and he said that when we use this term, it needs little caution. It refers to basic core of ego functions that characterize an individual throughout his life, meaning the nuclear self, then to surface attributes such as social roles, religious and national affiliations. Identity in this sense may constitute a person's emotional strength, despite the ups and downs of neurosis. Identity also refers to a conscious and pre-conscious configurations. Now, Erickson, this again, when you talk about identity and the self, we have been talking about consciousness. I said consciousness, it's not consciousness. The consciousness, as human beings, we are conscious, but we are also conscious of our consciousness. Now, this is the key thing. That conscious of consciousness is one of the key things when we try to understand the consciousness. Now, this concept of how conscious I am, introvert, when I say that how you go inwards, that you try to find out your own consciousness. But in that there are some, clauses that should be with a purpose, not without purpose. And secondly, it must have the purpose, it must have the intent, and which must be good. Ericksonian framework rests upon a distinction about the psychological sense of continuity, which we call as ego identity, sometimes referred as a self, which he tried to mix up. The personal idiosyncrasies that separate one person from the next, known as the personal identity, and the collection of the social roles that a person might play, the social identity or the cultural identity. The concept of self and identity are clearly different. The self is a depth psychological concept. It refers to a core of personality made up of various constituents in the interplay with the child's earlier self objects, which include the basic layers of personality from which emanate the striving for power or success furthermore. And it centralizes on ideal goals and, in addition, the basic talent and skills that mediate between ambition and ideals, all attached to the scene of being a knit in time and place in a recipient of impression or initiator of action. Self is distinct from identity. From the vantage point of self-psychology, there are two areas of interest: the process by which a self is formed, that is I, and the actual content of schemata, which composes the self-concept of me. This is again a very interesting, and one has to go very carefully into this. Relating the self-concept to self-esteem, the differences between complex and simple ways of organizing self-knowledge and the links between those organizing principles and the processing of information. Identity formation is the process of development of the distinct personality of an individual, regarded as a persisting identity known as personal continuity in a particular stage of life in which individual characteristics are possessed by which a person is recognized, known as, or the establishment of a reputation. Reputation is a part of identity, and it is not established in one day. It's a long process. It also conveys about the values. So when we talk about the ethical component, it comes. This process defines individuals to others and themselves. Pieces of entity, actual identity, include a sense of continuity, a sense of uniqueness from others, and a sense of affiliation. So all the three components are important. Different people have different perceptions about the self. This is not the same thing. And one of the things which I say, when we talk about consciousness and we try to see your own consciousness, one element which we miss is the mind which is seeing the mind. The mind, because in other organs, say when you are examining an object, it is quite different. But when object is also the same, for example, as a clinician, I always say, you can have a poor heart, but still you can be a good cardiologist. But if your mind is poor, you can't be a good psychiatrist or a neurologist. You have a strong mind. Otherwise, you may not be able to see these. Now, this is one person may look inward so that all external parameters are perceived to lie on the periphery and acquire substance only when they are internalized. Another way of perceiving the self as something formed as guided by the external parameters, that is society, cultural inheritance, and the prevalence of ideologies in a group. He may approve or disapprove of them. Identity is a development process occurring within the personality and has a powerful socio-cultural context, which is one of my main talk. When it is formed, identity formation is a universal feature of human experience. It is not something, it is one group is there and one culture is there, where it is not there. Cultural domain of identity is known as ethnic identity. Till recently, the cultural identity was something people had as undisturbed existential possession. You know, like even sometimes when we talk about identity, it's not only the person, the society, but when we change the name of a nation, when we change the name of a state or a city, it's a part of the same identity. You know, interestingly, when Chiang Kai-shek lost his kingdom, China, and went to Formosa, some of you might know, because he was the king of the king, and he was very uncomfortable with his identity. He had to change his name from Chiang Kai-shek, because he said, how can I be the Chiang Kai-shek when I just rule of a small, tiny place in Cambridgeta? So how the identity plays an important role in our life. It is also a common assumption that identity formation is a universal feature of human experience. Notion of identity negotiation may arise from the learning of social roles through personal experiences. There is the identity of the individuals, of groups, the identity of societies, which are constantly communicating with each other. Erikson, you know, like Erikson's writings, when you see from 50s to 60s or 80s, they're quite, they are evolving. Even like Sigmund Freud, what you see there in early part of 20th century or the before the Second World War or after the First War, his writings change, you know. Erikson explored identity development as observed through identity crisis with the failure to achieve ego identity during adolescence. The stage of psychosocial development in which identity crisis may occur is called the identity cohesion versus the role confusion stage. During the stage of adolescence, you know, Erikson's contribution was very immense in this particular field. We are faced, he said, with physical growth, biological and sexual maturation, and integrating our ideas of ourselves and about what others think of us. So, you know, both physiological, biological changes, how it affects our identity. As a part of the development process, we form our self-image and endure the task of resolving the crisis of our basic ego identity. Successful resolution of crisis depends on one's progress through previous developmental stages, centering on issues such as trust, autonomy, initiative, and guidance. Those who emerge from this stage with a strong sense of identity are well equipped to face adulthood with confidence and certainty. So identity is the point of convergence between the developed self as it is constituted in the adolescence and early adulthood and the socio-cultural position of the individual. This differentiation is very fruitful and useful. Some individuals are, for example, characterized by a strong, firm, well-defined self that was acquired early in the life, but their identity is due to the circumstances quite diffuse. The diffuseness of identity permits empathy with many different types of people, yet the firm self protects against fragmentation. There are people whose organization is very weak, but a strong, overlay, strong, rigid identity. These are the individuals whose cohesion is maintained by intensely experienced social roles and intensely experienced ethnic and religious sense of belonging. And these are the people, when they are taken from them, when they are moved from one culture to another, such as from village to the city, will psychologically disintegrate, and there are still others whose firm but not rigid identities rest on a firmly established self. Erikson, later in 80s, he observed that those who fail to achieve a cohesive identity, who experience an identity crisis, will exhibit a confusion of roles, not knowing who they are, where they belong, and where they want to go. This sort of unresolved crisis leaves individuals struggling to find themselves. It's a very common phenomenon these days, and it's very important for all the sociologists to understand this. They may go to seek a negative identity. Pathological identity development through alienation of oneself, and which may even involve taking drugs or committing crime, and the inability to make defining choices about the future. So the basic strength that should develop during adolescence is fidelity, which emerges from cohesive ego identity. Erikson described those going through an identity crisis as exhibiting confusion. They often seem to have no idea who or what they are, where they belong, and where they want to go. They may withdraw from normal life, not taking action or acting as they usually would work at and in their marriage or in the school. Erikson felt that in addition to family, peers have a strong impact on the development of ego, identity, and adolescence. Erikson was spending a lot of time in Ahmedabad. He was coming to the BM Institute, and he wrote about the biography of Mahatma Gandhi. This fragile time. Fidelity is known to encompass sincerity, genuineness, and a sense of duty in our relationship with other people. Thus, identity is described as a subjective sense as well as an observable quality of personal sameness and continuity, paired with some belief in the sameness and continuity of some shared world image. Then it will be possible for a person to have a healthy contact, to be empathetic, and will be able to resolve day-to-day conflicts. Now, identity as a cultural power. We may now examine identity as a cultural power, which surely lies at the heart of contemporary cultural imagination. The more robust view of power of identity is one to which anyone surviving the dramatic rise of social movements based around identity positions, gender, sexuality, religion, ethnic identities might easily subscribe. So by recognizing the self-significant cultural sources of resistance to the power of globalization goes a long way towards getting this power in perspective. Probably Mao Zedong realized the culture and identity. And he used this ideology very powerfully in quite a different context, of course. What we call ethnic identity may not be universal, but just one particular modern way of social organization. The social psychology of attachment to a locality or a group is a powerful phenomena, but is also a complex one, with different possible modes of articulation, different consequent implications for different sense of self and of existential well-being in the context of the religion, social status, and national identity. A cultural identity involves at its core a sense of attachment or commitment to a cultural group, and is both a cultural and psychological phenomena. It is necessary to state that culture is learned and not inborn. We learn what the symbols stand for, not born with cultures we learn from our parents or surrounding and friends and through enculturation. Enculturation is a process by which society's culture is transmitted from one generation to another. Everyone acquires culture after we are born. Children learn about their culture through observation of their parents, siblings, teachers, friends, and now the internet and the TV play a powerful role. Cultural identity, all cultures are dynamic, they are ever-changing. Many cultures today, they are different from what they were 100 years earlier. With passage of time, they are not static. Culture change is also both, culture change is also both by invention and diffusion. Invention means internal, where new things or ideas, and diffusion is by external, spreading of cultural elements from one culture to another. In recent times, modern communication is enhancing this process in a greater speed. This process of cultural globalization is causing a visible change both in individual and group identity. I think last few decades, this change is so visible and so vast, and impact is so profound that we have to, I think, make this as a separate subject of a study. The cultural identity was something people had cherished as undisturbed existential possession in which there is the inheritance of continuity with the past. But the corrosive power of globalization is slowly but certainly destroying the identities of the individuals, identities of the groups, and also the national identity. The disturbance in identity development can turn up in every phase of this lifelong process. Identity is certainly people's source of meaning and experience. Cultural fragmentation, hybridization, narcissistic identities, postmodernism, localization strategies as part of the cyclic phases of the world system. Such phenomena existed at certain points in past cycles. They could well do again in the future, and now it is our responsibility to focus our energies on this subject. Our individuality is socially produced and is by now a trivial truth, but the obverse of this truth needs yet to be repeated more often. The shape of our sociality and so of the society we share depends in turn on the way in which the task of individualization is framed up and responded to. To put it in a nutshell, individualization consists in transforming human identity from a given into a task, as now has become a prism through which we perceive. The human self exists at the interface between the body and the social system. Social and cultural systems define identities, and the human acquires selfhood in order to function in these systems. Self begins with the physical body, with acting and choosing as a unity and as a point of reference, distinct from others. It acquires meaning, content by participating in the social system, starting from the family. The self is not contained in the brain, but rather the human brain learns to operate self. Relationship with the self and sickness have not been investigated adequately with reference to their influence. What is the relation between theories of self, particularly identity theory, and a schizophrenic process? The person's body is there, the brain is there. Now, this is very fascinating when you see what happens to them. Schizophrenia is an illness, one that may overtake and redefine the identity of a person. Schizophrenia is a disorder that by definition affects individuals' perception and cognition and compromises social identity and functioning. The change wrought by schizophrenia affects self in a broad context, encompassing such things as self-concept, self-awareness, self-functioning, and self-career. Thus, schizophrenia erodes and undermines organizations and functioning of the self. And because of this, schizophrenia and self subjectively are integrally interlinked. A fundamental assumption in identity theory is that a person's self includes a hierarchically organized set of identities. When an individual set of identities is limited in range and diffusely organized, he or she is thought to be at risk for schizophrenia. Let us take the example of who is the person or self suffering from. Those of you who have seen some of this Alzheimer's disease, the person is there. Who is he? He does not know who am I, where I belong, which country, which home. Now, what happens to these persons? So, identity and coping with mental illness is a problem because chronicity is conceived as the loss of self and positive social roles. I'll just conclude by saying that identity is a people's source of meaning and experience, which is the key thing. The person develops his or personality within the group right from the time of conception. The group context integrates the person, and identity differentiates the person outside of the group.
That is, before 1950s, the concept of identity and self were not there in our literature.
Psychoanalysis.
In psychoanalytical literature. From 1950s onwards, particularly in Erickson's theory, first we came across the word identity. It's more of personal and socio-cultural entity that he spoke of. And this identity point he established especially during the psychosocial development of adolescence. The virtue point of this adolescence is called to be fidelity. Fidelity, as you explained, seemed to be the cohesive ego integrity. So the outcome is this virtue, fidelity. But whatever little that I understand of Ericksonian theory, the root point of this identity is the first stage of that psychosocial development, that is trust. Trust versus mistrust. My question is, can you relate this embeddedness of fidelity in the trust point?
You know, the fidelity and trust would go together. And I say that trust and fidelity is a part of our values. And values are learned. They are not inborn. Though there are some people who believe that certain values are transmitted from one generation to another, but actually they are also learned, because they transmit from one. So actually I would see that there's the same thing, but see different facets of trust and the fidelity, and the values, which. But in this, the family and the culture or our social environment plays a very important role.
And fidelity, can it be synonymously used with self-confidence? Because you said this is cohesive, ego-integrated aspect.
When we talk about ego,
self-confidence and fidelity.
Self-confidence and fidelity will also go together.
Thank you.
The Taittiriya Upanishad contains a famous story of the interaction between Maharishi Bhrigu and his father. It's called the Bhrigu Vali. Did you ever read it?
Can you repeat this question?
Yes. The Taittiriya Upanishad contains the famous story of the interaction between Maharishi Bhrigu and his father Varuna. Did you ever read it?
No.
It contains the key to the identity of self, the identification of self, and the process of self-realization.
That will say, when I say, let me again say about self-realization, what one self realizes, it is not the same what other would realize.
That is because the enlightened person realizes the self, and everyone else realizes what is not the self. This is the difference between vidya and avidya. The point in vidya is that it does not depend on culture, it does not depend on personality, it does not depend on individuality. It is the identification with the primordial being. This is the real self. This is Atma. This is the way Atma Darshanam begins.
When you say the person, it does not depend on others, but when a person starts experiencing oneself, is he before he was born, after the born, or when he became adult? This is very important, because if he is adult, he is influenced by the environment, the mother, the father, the family, and other things.
No, sir. No, sir. Every great guru of this generation had no guru to teach them.
I'm not talking
Jagi Vasudev, Ramana Maharshi, Anandamaya Ma, Amritanandamaya Ma, none of them had gurus to tell them. They knew it internally because they had the experience of being.
No, I'm not talking about the guru. I'm talking about the family.
But the guru is all that counts. There is nothing higher than the guru, sir.
One part which I would say, when you say guru, what is a guru? There is an interesting thing, like in Mahabharata, when Eklavya goes to Dronacharya to learn the art of archery as a guru, and Dronacharya says no, he makes the idol. And the idol, which is of the sand and the mud, and say, I want to learn the art of archery, and he's become better than the Arjuna. Now the question, who was the guru? The idol of the mud or the real Dronacharya? I would say, yes, it was not the mud, but it was a faith. It was in belief. So actually the faith and belief plays a very important role in our life, which we forget and make them as a guru. So if you have faith and if you have, yeah.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Amartya Sen talks about the multiple identities and the expressions of those multiple identities in terms of what is happening in the society. Now, you are using the term hierarchy, but instead of hierarchy, it's really another metaphor, which is the basket of identities, rather than the hierarchy of identities, or a matrix of identities. And so, like for example, the terrorism, has to be addressed from this perspective. It's not a hierarchy, it's a basket, and out of that, one element of the basket is finding an expression in different ways. And then you are using the phrase cultural globalization. And I think it's not cultural globalization, it is cultural colonization, which is really affecting the rest of the world. So we have to respond.
Yes, I share with you. But when you talk about multiple this thing, and we talk about hybridization, like the terms overlap. Hybrid, it is the multiple identities.
My identity.
Which, yes, yeah. Thank you.